All right. Well, thank you for joining me. Today, I had the pleasure of interviewing Josh Friedman. Josh obtained his PhD from Columbia University, where he studied applications of cognitive science to education. As a doctoral student, Josh worked closely with Dr. Ray Lee at Columbia Zuckerman Mind, Brain, and Behavior Institute, where he studied a dual fMRI brain scan approach to quantify face-to-face human communication at the network level of brain activity. Now, Josh is working with Dr. Alfredo Spagna using brain waves and body signals to predict student attention in the classroom. And more generally, Josh's work focuses on how social context shapes cognitive and neurological processes, especially related to learning.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Josh, a minute to say a little bit about your background, how you came to look at the questions that you're now studying.
Would love to. What I tell people is I grew up at summer camp. I had the privilege to do so, and also at public school. And I grew up from the beginning wondering why public school couldn't be more like summer camp, and why, in fact, it wasn't. In public school, I sat there day after day in 8 rows of 4, staring forward, listening to what my teacher said, and quite honestly, falling asleep most of the time, mentally at least, if not physically. And when I went to summer camp, I was engaged, I was active, I was curious. All kind of led to a desire to teach how to think in that sort of way in school, rather than the way that, you show up and you accept what authority tells you. The answer was to go find somewhere around the world where I could do that. I taught on 5 different continents over the course of 5 years. And it was incredibly satisfying and enriching. I applied to this program at Columbia and miraculously got in while I was teaching in Bolivia at the time. Changed my plans, bought a plane ticket, ended up in New York City, which I never thought I would be in. And, of course, what do you find out when you go and look into the data of a problem that seems pretty gripping to you as an individual? As it turns out, we have the data. There's data out there that suggests that critical thinking is built better in constructive environments, interactive environments, socially and emotionally supportive environments. How can we translate the things that we're learning about the brain and the mind to something that structurally works for education? What are the strategies that can be shared between educators and administrators, between administrators and parents?
Great. So awesome. So for context to the listeners, I had Josh send me a couple of papers that would be of kind of a useful framing for the discussion. We're not going to go through the papers one by one we're not going to go through them in a detailed fashion, and we're not going to talk about each one in succession. I think we'll just kind of weave throughout them and reference them as we need to. So I want to talk about social learning, and I want to get to the implications for education towards the end of our discussion. Can you briefly just say what neuroplasticity is? Because it's a concept that undergirds a lot of the discussion. So yeah, can you just briefly describe, so what is neuroplasticity, how does it come to be, and what is its relationship to learning?
Yeah, well, I will give you answers that I have, which for those questions are not probably the absolutely most informed answers on the topic, and even the most informed answers on the topic are still very actively learning the answers to all 3 of those questions, right? But given that, neuroplasticity is this idea, kind of very straightforward and simple, that your brain changes. That your brain is we refer to this as plastic, that it's moldable, that it's shapeable, right? So, the idea of neuroplasticity in some sense is that it's experience recorded in the changes of your neural structure. The idea is that neuroplasticity is change in the brain, as its moldable, shapeable nature. It arises from experience, or the interaction between experience and the individual's history and environment, and it's related to learning as the absolute sort of biophysical structure of the thing itself. It is the learning. As we learn, our brain changes and we sort of solidify more robust certain connections, certain associations between the things we perceive in the environment and our actions in them, as opposed to others.
Really, there's this idea within neuroplasticity that there are different regions of the brain that, when they are activated at the coordination with one another, that these 2 different networks become strengthened, or the connections between them become strengthened. And so, for example, learning about number, the concept of number arises through the activation of a couple of different regions of the brain. And so the coordinated activation of those different networks gives us a sense of what number is. That is generally referred to as inter-brain plasticity. So that I think that's kind of the terminology that some of the work that you've have been influenced by it references it. Can you say what the difference is between interbrain plasticity and intra-brain plasticity? Because I think this is a jump that you find intriguing.
I do. I most definitely do. Okay, so to clarify some terms, right? Inter-brain plasticity would be between brain plasticity, whereas intra-brain plasticity would be within one brain, these different regions, as you mentioned, changing together or becoming more changeable together, more precisely. So in intra-brain plasticity, I largely rely on this view from Lisa Feldman Barrett and her colleagues of this idea of like there's hubs in the brain. There are certain areas that are essentially like major railway stations where you can land there and go many different places. And each of those places that those major hubs can go to in the brain, those places don't go to as many other places, right? They're less connected than the hubs themselves. So we sort of like have this hub network within our brain.
Yeah.
But the main idea is that these hubs sort of, are coordinators or conductors of activity to a much greater degree of neural activity within the brain to a much greater degree than other areas in the brain. And when those hubs start to dance together, start to be responsive to the particular experience, to the particular environment together, they are more likely to become more changeable together. So when we say intra-brain plasticity as a result of intra-brain synchrony, we're saying something like, because of the engagement of the prefrontal cortex and the motor cortex in this environment, as you mentioned, the sort of example of math, as I sort of like move my eyes along a number line and my eye tracks, from my frontal eye field, sort of this area in my brain that's like moving my eyes to look at the next destination, and I'm reasoning through a number line, first it's 1, then it's 2, then it's 3, as both of these areas are very active, that sort of intra-brain synchronization tends to increase plasticity of both of those regions, more so than if just one of those regions was involved. We can think of the same thing not happening within two hubs of one brain, but between two brains, each in some sense as a hub itself, but more precisely as sort of like each as a hub of hubs, if you will. Let me just bring it down to ground level for a moment. In Shemaim Tesori's example, the most straightforward sort of visual of this is two people dancing together. So I'm a dance teacher, you're a dance student. The idea is that I'm teaching you how to dance, and the idea is that you're learning from me how to dance. So what are you doing? Well, or rather, let's start with what I'm doing as the teacher. So I'm doing a dance move, and I'm saying, do it like me, and I'm doing this dance move, and I'm showing it to you, and I'm showing it to you, and you're looking at my action in the environment, right? So my action becomes a part of that environment that is causing or making more likely neuroplastic change in your brain. There's something more complex going on, though. The teacher is also watching their dance move and the student's dance move and trying to predict how the student is going to, if you will, mess up next. What's the next mistake or the subtle change or misfire the student is going to make next? The teacher then it's been shown, the teacher amplifies or emphasizes the part of their movement that they're predicting the student is going to get wrong next. So they did this with a teacher and a student moving Towers of Hanoi puzzles. That's a logic puzzle where you've got 3 rods and you sort of move one disc to another to start from a certain setup of the discs to a final solution to the setup of the discs where they're all kind of in size order in particular ways. Okay, so they're moving these discs from one stick, pointing up in the air to another, and they're both solving puzzles across from each other. And what they found was that the movement of the teacher in moving their discs was exaggerated in the movements that the student had continued to get wrong. Like physically, the teacher put more emphasis on moving this disc. They made it higher when the student had gotten that move wrong. And the student responded to that movement. They noticed the exaggeration. The more the teacher exaggerated the movement, the more the student made the correction. So there's this responsiveness to not just how the student is paying attention to the teacher's actions and thus changing their own, but there's this responsiveness to how the teacher is changing their actions in response to what they're seeing in the student. And that change the teacher makes has an effect on the student's changes, which then leads to learning. It's not the case that the student is the one changing and the teacher is staying exactly the same. The teacher is also changing in response to the student. And so because we see that change at the same time and we detect it through fairly gross measures of brain activity like frequency waves or blood activity in a particular area, we say interbrain plasticity, we say interbrain synchronization, because they both have activity changing at the same time. And the more that they have that activity changing at the same time, the more their own individual activity in future environments has changed. That's the really wild finding.
Just that by them coming into some kind of coordination with each other, they are one another to sort of enter some kind of dynamic. And that at a future point, they're able to more easily enter that same dynamic. Is that what you're saying?
I am saying that. It is relationship specific, yes, and the more they're able to individually do the thing later, right? The more a teacher teaches, the better they get. Yes. The more the teacher teaches in that moment, the more the teacher responds to that student in the moment, the better that teacher gets at responding to more students in the future. The better the student learns in that moment, the better they learn the dance, the better they learn the solution to the puzzle problem, the better they're able to complete the puzzle problem in the future. The more that they have these interbrain plastic changes in that moment.
If we take, just to kind of stay with this example, the dancer, so we have a dance teacher, one person is the leader, the other person is following. And similarly in instruction, like a student and a teacher, they have different roles. If a parent is speaking to a child and enunciating mispronunciations that the child may do, these are all examples where two people are in a dynamic and they have different roles. And so part of what I think is interesting about this idea is that at one level, it seems like it's obviously true that humans are extremely efficient at learning from one another. That seems self-evident.
It's pretty much the thing that we're best at. One finding that's actually, or one theoretical position that's kind of come to the fore is that actually humans aren't great at learning. We're really not so at within a lifetime, a single individual learning something new that has never happened in the world before. We are really good at learning generationally, culturally. We're really good at passing down learning to new people growing up in our world.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so what I think is really interesting, so one thing I kind of want to, thinking while kind of looking at some of these papers, is that so we go back to the dance example. Dance it's not that I'm not saying I can't dance. But it's conceptually simple. If I'm learning to tango and I have a partner, I get that person is going to be dancing in a particular kind of way that is causing me to pick up a sense of rhythm and a sense of movement that I am then eventually, with enough practice, am going to be able to sort of emulate and then eventually come maybe even to teach someone else. What I'm doing is I'm perceiving movement and intention that another person is doing, and I'm able to respond to it. And conceptually, that's just because motor movement, perceiving, if I see you move, it's very easy for me to model that movement internally of how I would also do that. Even if it's challenging for me to actually do, I get how I could come to do what you're doing if you're dancing. What I think is a question that arose for me while I was looking at some of these papers is how complicated the kinds of ideas are that can be modeled. So it's kind of stepping up from dancing to somewhat more complicated concepts. Very often, so when you say that humans, like a lot of human learning obviously is learning a huge number of we are a cultural species, we're a learning species. And there's this phenomenon in humans of over-imitation, which is that children and adults will over-imitate a high-status person when doing a thing. For example, there was this study where there was a situation, it was a chimpanzee and an adult, and a child, and the adult model was trying to get a piece of fruit that was inside of this box, and so the adult has like these tooth that they stick inside, one like horizontally and one vertically, and by doing this they're able to sort of extract this piece of fruit. And so the child watches in one study, the chimpanzee watches in the other study. And in both cases, when the child and the chimpanzee are given the box, they're able to replicate the behavior. Separate condition, the same exact box was there, except the box was clear so they could see inside. And what you could see when it was a clear box is that when they stuck in the horizontal stick, it was irrelevant, it didn't do anything. But the vertical stick, that's the one that mattered. And so when they then gave the box to the chimpanzee is like, obviously you're not going to use the horizontal stick, this is like totally irrelevant. And so they didn't use the horizontal stick at all, and they just used the vertical one. It's a really good indication of how smart chimpanzees are. When they gave them to the child did both anyway. And extraneous or superfluous behavior, they're over-imitating. They're doing more than they needed to because it's something that was modeled by a high-status person. And so, I think what this gets at is that for more complicated phenomena that are more complicated than dancing, it can be very challenging to actually model what it is that the other person is trying to do. It can be you can't, without knowing what the other person is doing, you can't really model intent. So I guess I'll stop there and kind of see what your reaction is to that. Do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah.
What are your reactions?
Yeah. Well, so I would just sort of pause for a moment and say that I don't see the evidence for the inference that it was about the high status individual. But like one thing that is that these, what we tend to call mentalizing abilities, where we're trying to imagine what the intent is behind an individual and what they're doing. So I'm gonna sidestep the high status individual question for a moment. 100% I'm with you on imitation. It's a crazy important behavior. It's really hard to overestimate its importance, I think, and it's really valuable to try to think about its subtle variations in even the most complex of behaviors. From my own work, we've shown that, teachers and students will imitate each other and with their faces in an online face-to-face environment. They'll imitate each other's faces, and the more that they do, the more that'll benefit reasoning tasks. We're talking about logical reasoning tasks, sort of which way a gear will turn in a chain of gears. We're talking about scientific experiment tasks, where I'm designing an experiment, I'm generating a hypothesis. The more that I've aligned my face with my partner here, my teacher or the student, the better the student performs on the task. That's kind of crazy. Like, why should it matter what my face is doing or how my face is moving in order to perform better on a higher level reasoning task? The explanation there we don't really have yet, but I just mention it to make the point that, the value of imitation is really hard to overestimate. And why might that be in regards to our earlier conversation, or the complexity of dance, or who's leading and who's following? All of it, again, I think just kind of comes down to this, when we say interbrain plasticity, what do we mean? It means that more people, besides just myself, are interacting with the same environment, and it gives me more data to kind of calculate the value across. Whether it's the value of a horizontal stick, or it's the value of a subtle movement of the elbow, or it's the value of how I emphasize one particular disc movement from one pylon to another, or the value of how I move my face while I'm indicating that I'm thinking more deeply about some aspect of a scientific problem or otherwise. Like those signals, again, your brain is doing more than your mind is aware of. Those signals are picked up as a part of a dynamic trajectory of that other agent beside myself that I'm trying to understand the intent of. They indicate that person's intent, right? And by participating, by imitating in that thing, I get better at developing that understanding of intent. And it's understanding the intent that helps me make the perception action link. And now that I've done it, give that kid the box again. See what they do on the second and the third, and compare that to a situation in which they didn't see anybody do anything with sticks in a box, and a situation where they saw somebody only use a vertical stick. That kind of data would be fascinating. And this goes to song learning paper as well. What they did was they had a teacher and they had a student. The teacher was teaching the song. The student was supposed to learn the song. They had the few conditions, but the main ones I'm going to talk about are just comparing delivering stimulation to their brains in the same place versus a sham condition, right? And what do they find? They find that, and it's particular where it is in the brain. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but the idea is that it's in the motor cortex. So I'm delivering stimulation to you and to me as I teach you the song in the same place. And what does that do? What they showed was that if I'm being stimulated, if we're both being stimulated in that area, that has an increased effect on song learning, causally.
Yeah. So they are inducing an electrical current into the same region of the brain for both people, and when they do that, the coordination or song learning task that these two people are having to do is improved. One could quibble with like the effect size of this kind of thing, or because I think they were only improved in the improvement in melody. So it is possible, I think, maybe to quibble with like how strong the effect was, but at the same time, I think the researchers would also totally agree that it's still a fairly crass experiment. You're still applying a large electrical current to a large part of the brain. It's not that specified, and so I think it would be unexpected that it would work that well to really coordinate between two people. But what I think is really remarkable about it is it's at least a first demonstration that the synchronization of a region of the brain causally affects the acquisition of a skill or of learning, which I do think is super remarkable and really interesting. And something else that I find really interesting about this work is that a lot of it is. With this paper, do you mind if I just quick explain what the experimental setup of it was?
Please.
So, two people are right next to each other, and they're basically just have their right hands with their index finger out in front of them, and they're just raising their finger up and down, up and down, up and down, and they just have cameras on both of these people, and they're taking a video to measure the frequency that they're raising and lowering their right index finger. For the first period of the experiment, there's a barrier between these two people, so they're not able to see each other. And so they're just kind of both raising their fingers up and down, up and down, and up and down. Then they take away the barriers so the two people are facing each other and they can see each other. As they're continuing to raise up their fingers up and down, sometimes the people will see each other and they start raising and lowering their fingers in synchrony. Sometimes some of the people don't change the frequency that they're moving their finger, but the other person changes it to match the other person. Sometimes they're just like ships passing in the night and they don't really care. And then they take this barrier and they put it back between these two people. Some of the time maintain the frequency that they had both converged on. Sometimes one person stays and the other person leaves, and sometimes they both leave. And in the case when they both pass in the middle of the night, they both do their own thing. It's a very simple experiment. The actual mechanics of interpreting the information isn't simple, but the setup is simple. And what I think is really remarkable about it is that it's, well, I mean, do you want to say like what the, so with that as a setup, do you want to say like what some of the conclusions were of that paper? Because it's what I took that paper as doing is getting at this basic question of how that people, we use these very kind of like, we have these colloquialisms like that, we are really clicking with each other, or we are really vibing, or we are on the same wavelength. This sense that two people like really get each other. Like I think empirically, people have a sense that that's a phenomenon. Like that is a real thing. But it's also, and because it's a real thing and because it's a real psychological state, we should expect that will be cashed out neurologically in some fashion. Like it will be an empirical phenomenon that is studyable, but it's also clearly very complicated, and it's a subtle thing to study. And so what I take this as doing is kind of beginning to answer, or beginning to I would take a very, very simple circumstance to try to get this question of like how well two people are vibing with each other. Can you just talk a little bit about sort of why you think that study is important and what you take from it?
I agree with everything you've said. A lot of this work comes out of Scott Kelso's lab at Florida State University or Florida Atlantic University. It's one of the two. Craig Norton was one of his students. And yeah, to me, this paper was in the most simplest form, the thing that I read and I was like, that's what I'm talking about. Because as you mentioned, there are all these different forms of what happens out of that experiment. You mentioned this idea of vibing, right? Like vibing is like the most colloquial thing these days. Like it was a good vibe. We were vibing. Like she had a good vibe. Whatever it was, we're vibrating. That had a good vibration. Yeah? Like we respond to frequencies, to things that sound good is a really inadequate word to describe this, right? It's really valuable, I think, to think in terms of harmony in this case, in terms of what noise-canceling technology does, to think in terms of when a sound is harsh versus melodic. There are people that sound harsh to us, and I think that those things are literally different, like physically experienced as different across different people. There are like this is a cultural phenomenon that some music sounds good in some cultures, some music not so much, and vice versa in another culture, right? If you pick it, and it goes down to the notes that are selected and the scales that are used. But the idea, essentially, that I come out of the Norton paper with, is that, as you mentioned, right? There are people that experience each other across that barrier once it comes down as like, oh. Like I can vibe with this person. They go along with my sort of movement profile, if you will. You know, there's the idea of like choosing a key in music, right? Maybe they have the same key that I do, or a compatible one that I can jazz with, right? Like there are things that we can flip between. There are others that we meet and it's like, no way, definitely not. And the way that they're moving, I don't understand. I don't know how to build or mentalize about their intent for my own action prediction, right? And so in the simplest way, though as you mentioned, not at all simple when it gets down to the math, but if you change as a response to me, or I change as a response to you, or we change as a response to one another, magic moment, the more I change in the second period, right? In the third period, actually, right? Like, so I'm going by myself and I'm doing the thing, and then we do it together, and that interbrain neuroplastic change that we're interested in. Go ahead.
What do you think are the? Sorry, I cut you off. What do you think? I mean, they talk a little bit about what they think what individual differences what factors could contribute to why it is that people vibe with each other. And I was thinking during it that it really, I mean, what they're looking at is whether or not one person is whether or not people begin to imitate each other, or how much people are kind of willing to cohere into something. And it made me think of, there's this, I don't know if this like dating advice or something that like, if you're on a date and you're not sure if the other person likes you, you can kind of like get in a certain kind of like posture and see if they reflect it, because if they reflect it, they're probably like you. Just like this recognition that people are very subconsciously and physically empathic and will unconsciously reflect what other people are doing. That would be a case where two people are divergent and then they come in and they meet one another, and then after they no longer see each other, maybe would continue on the same wavelength. there are other cases where person really does all of the movement and synchronizes with the other person who doesn't do anything at all. I'm curious what your thoughts on this are. My impression with that is that seems it may be a quality of individual difference, that an individual, someone who's changing the frequency of their speed, they're doing their thing, and the other person is more highly agreeable or something, more highly influenced by things around them. Like maybe they are more impressionable, and so that person is doing all of the movement. Do you have thoughts on how to think about these different outcomes of the degree to which people merged and didn't?
To say that attempting an analysis of those differences is incredibly complex is inadequate, right? I mean, it is potentially impossibly complex to be able to predict it systematically. And I use those words very carefully. Could I explain what happened in post? Yeah, I could probably, if I did a whole lot of work to analyze
Sure.
every single possible hypothesis I had, I could probably give you an explanation and quantify that explanation as to this was the degree that this played a role, this was the degree that that played a role, this was the degree that that played a role. But can I then use that learning as a prediction for what's going to happen between those two people in the next moment, or between that person and another person, or between those two people in another environment? Like, all of that is potentially impossible to really go forward with. If we're really asking the question of how do I think about these incredibly complex social neurological situations, I rely on a lot of the work that originally, or at least colloquially in the Western canon, comes from Bronfenbrenner's work on ecological psychology, and more recently is really talked about by Lisa Feldman Barrett in the neuroscience space, and Mary Helen Immordino Yang in the educational neuroscience space, where they really talk about these layers of predictability, where you sort of have like the individual body, sort of like what the body, biologically, chemically is going to do. The brain, which they kind of mostly refer to as this embodied brain, sort of like, right, like it's not just a brain detached, it has a body that's responding to its own needs in the environment. You then have what you think of as social group or social environment, social situation. What people are there? Who are those other people? What are the other brains that those other people have? Right? And then within that, you have this kind of like cultural sphere where there's this set of expectations that come from a lifetime, several generational lifetimes of learning and deciding the rules that we operate by. And you would have to know, right, and have data on each and every one of these levels to the most particular detail in order to predict what's going to happen at any one of the others, because they're all entirely intercorrelated, right? But at the same time have causal impact on one another, and not in simple linear ways often, right? In dynamic ways, in ways that change over time, that have spikes and have flat lines, that aren't some consistent, from the bottom left to the upper right.
And what I think is really interesting about this is like, so the system is just like so incredibly complicated, and it's probably like not, as you're saying, it's not actually, I don't know how, like the degree to which you can explain any part of this, you're only going to be able to explain a very small fraction of the extent to which two people like vibe together or something, because of all of these overlapping layers of influence. But at the same time, what's really fascinating is that people themselves do actually integrate a huge amount of information that is being transferred from other people.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Like, I didn't want to interrupt you, and I just did anyway. But the point bears incredibly important emphasis, right? And this is exactly what I mean by your brain is doing far more than your mind is aware of. When we look at science, we're doing a mind activity. We're trying to explain to ourselves in our own language what's going on. And that's incredibly complex and difficult. And at the same time, it's the most straightforward and simple thing that we do all the time, because I can feel whether or not I'm vibing with somebody. Like, and it just happens.
Yeah.
I just get a summary, report from my brain to my mind that's like, this feels right or this feels wrong. And that's it. That it's incredibly difficult to overestimate how complex that calculation and that operation is that's going on.
Yeah, and it makes me think. I mean, even beyond just like vibing with people, that's even the most basic level of an interaction with another person, because there are way more complicated. You could call them mentalities. I don't exactly know what to call them, but sort of microcultures, mentalities, I suppose, that are communicated between people. For example, like, there's some labs that have just put out, or some mentors who have had several students who have become Nobel laureates. And, you just kind of wonder what was in the atmosphere of that kind of lab, or what the kind of modeling that was being done by an instructor who, or by a teacher who I just really loved a subject, and who was sort of able to communicate in a lot of very implicit ways how to approach a topic, and inquiry, and how to think about things. That is clearly communicated by not just in this very kind of not just in this very academic. If you have a close friend who introduces you to a kind of thing, if you are like finding yourself, you have a friend who's like really into cooking, and you cook with that person, I mean, they kind of implicitly give you a lot of information about how to approach any number of things. I mean, that whole system is so complicated, and yet the information is still being efficiently transferred. The recipient is still able to pick up, like, oh, that's how you. There's like, I don't know, a sense of joy or something, or a sense of appreciation. I mean, I think like one more thought on this, and then I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Just like a really good, if you're trying to teach say you have like you're teaching Shakespeare or something in high school, it's like incredibly challenging to teach. It's very, very, it's very separate from people's experience. But if you have a teacher who's really into it, and like clearly loves it on their own, you can be in a situation where you really realize that there's something there. And or a calc class, or some other just kind of like very kind of dense material, if you have someone who's really into it, there is this impression that can be conveyed that is so generative. And yeah, I'm considering how complicated all of the different levels and factors are that contribute to even the simplest question of whether or not two people's index fingers will move at the same frequency, and whether or not they'll be receptive to each other. People are still able to culture in this just kind of remarkable way. So
I couldn't agree more. I have so many thoughts going, but I just want to highlight, I think, two very impactful ones, for me at least. One is I constantly walk around with Maya Angelou's words in my head, which are that, people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, they'll never forget how you made them feel. I think that it comes home to me all the time, and in incredibly important ways. In particular, in terms of the dancing and the watching the subtle movements and things like, we aren't learning a definition in class. You're not going there to figure out that, like, oh yeah, this line in this poem or this sonnet means this. There's not a one-to-one thing that once you've got that one-to-one link, is okay, now I get Shakespeare. It's way more subtle than that, and what we mean by that is it's dynamic. In particular, I live in New York City or around it, and for many years I was lucky enough to have a brother that worked at the public theater, and they would get me tickets to what's called Shakespeare in the Park, and we would go to Shakespeare in the Park, full Shakespeare plays, modernized in various ways, chopped and screwed and sort of thing, but Shakespeare nonetheless, and for the public and free. And I would go to these, and there would be brief, fleeting moments of something that felt real, and most of the time I was bored, and most of the time I was kind of like, what's
Sure.
going on? And I compare that to the absolutely eminent, impactful, and star in my mental life, Paula J., who was my senior AP English teacher and had an incredible impact on my own life in numerous ways. She would read not just Shakespeare, but other novels, pieces, she would read to us. 18-year-olds, she would walk up and down the room reading to us. And not because we couldn't read, and not because, she didn't think that we were gonna read. She told us to read. She built relationships with us that made us feel compelled to read. And then when we read before class, we showed up, and then she read to us again. And in that process, we saw and had data. Here's how I read it. Here's how she's reading it. To compare, how does she move through this text differently than how I did? And how does that movement, that dynamicness that she brings to it, elucidate a greater, what you referred to as generative, what I might refer to as sort of creative impact that she brought out of the text in both poetry and in prose? Because the way that she was reading it helped you know how to think, feel about it, how to notice things, how to feel your way through those things, what words to keep track of and to hold in your working memory while new words came in, right? That dynamicness in Shakespeare and in many other things is so valuable, is so important. There's a reason why Shakespeare has lasted as long as it has, right? It's such good content for doing it, but it's not certain. You can't sit there and read a Shakespeare and expect that you're going to get the beauty of it entirely. You need to sit there and listen to a master. And so, suddenly, I now understand a signal, a route, an intent, a goal along the journey of becoming a master in that work, in that dance, because I've seen it and I've experienced it, right? Not as a learner, but as a generational learner, as a cultural learner, right? As somebody that's been welcomed into that culture. That social and emotional aspect of learning is undeniable by anybody that really spends time thinking about it.
Yeah, maybe is important just to say here also that it's not just about high culture or something either. Like rap is something that's pretty dense and difficult to be moved by if you don't have the right cultural codes for understanding it. But if you're with a person who's like really into something, then you can similarly begin to kind of attempt to model what it is that's interesting and moving and beautiful about that.
I've said it before to people. I can get interested in anything that somebody else is really interested about. Anything that somebody else is really passionate about, like I'll be swept up in, without a doubt. Because they see something in there that has motivated their whole spirit. Like, there's gotta be something there. Why would they spend all this time doing it? Like, they're not crazy. They've made it this long through life. Like, there's something going on there. And it's not high culture, low culture. It's not kitsch. It's not camp. There's something to the art, to the science, to the art in the science, and the science and the art that we all create or identify, and that affects us differently, right? In terms of, I move at this frequency, and this is the one I'm moving at, right? Like, or, hey, wow, that's an interesting frequency. Let me see if I can vibe with that. You might be in one key, I might be in another key. I might not really know much about your key, but I can appreciate it. I can see you moving in it, I might not be able to move in it so well. It might not be able to affect me so strongly. And in a strange psychology lab environment where everything is cold and kind of unyielding, right? Like, I might be more like, get me the hell out of here. I'm moving my finger or whatever. Let me move on. But in an environment where you're being allowed the space to really breathe, to inspire the people around you, right? Like, that can change anybody, I truly believe, no matter what it is. It's about us as individuals, talking about the many subtle, complex factors that play a role. It's about us as individuals in any particular environment having time, space, energy, metabolism for that thing, and that person who is so passionate about that thing showing up and also having the energy as well. But when both of those things happen, when a really good class happens, it's because the students showed up and the teacher showed up. It's not just because the teacher is a saint, and it's not just because the students are good students. It's because they're vibing with each other. They've both decided that they have the energy, and they're going to put in the energy. They're going to contribute the energy to play in each other's key. That's...
I want to get your thoughts on how, sort of what we've been discussing, how you see this affecting sort of concrete and practical changes to the educational system.
Yeah.
How do you think about this?
Yeah. There are certain dramatic examples I think we all have in mind that sort of key in exactly what that thing was, even if we can't describe or explain its many complexities. There was a situation in ninth grade geography where every single day I had a teacher that would come in the room, he'd turn off the lights, he'd turn on the one little TV box hanging in the corner and have PowerPoint slides like off in this little corner, you know, that we were supposed to be listening to him drone over as he spoke for the 45 minutes straight. And to make it worse, just to really paint the picture for you, if you fell asleep in this class, which I did not infrequently, because who wouldn't? He had a baseball bat at the front of the room, big, like Louisville Slugger, like wooden baseball bat. And he would come over to your desk in the middle of his droning on, no pause, no nothing, no indication that something was about to happen, and just take the base of the bat and slam it down on the corner of your desk where your head was not. And of course, this was like, you know, shocking. It was jarring, to say the absolute least. What's wrong with education? That. The idea that there is like some responsibility, single responsibility that the student has. Stay awake. Anything else you do, we don't care. I can do whatever I want to as the teacher because I'm in charge, and you stay awake so that as I drone on, I can feel that your energy is receiving mine. In my mind, though, the guy himself was a nice guy, and he was my coach on the soccer field, and we had a good relationship, like, that guy as a teacher, obnoxious, like selfish, right? Not aware, not actually teaching his students in those moments at all. There were other moments where he engaged. But when the direction is one way, that's the biggest problem. How can these things that we've been talking about enhance or inform the practice of education? I just draw it back to Paula J, because I do for many things, right? She had a certain way. She would ask us a question standing at the front of the room after we had, read something. Not her reading it, but we were supposed to read something before class. We show up at the beginning of class. She's standing there, ready with her book, about to read to us, and asks us a question about the book instead. And waits a long time while everybody is sort of looking around, thinking, did you read? Oh, I don't know how to answer this question. She's staring at all of us in the eye. This is so awkward. And I do this to my students now, of course. And she's waiting for us to take the challenge, to take a bite, to take a chance. And she's walking up and down the aisle. Nobody's saying anything. And she says to us, with the most, imagine the most loving kindness, sternness, and unrelenting faces you can imagine, with tiny little smirks in the corner of her mouth. She says to us, well, is anybody going to say anything, or are you all just going to sit there continuing to wallow in your own ignorance? And she said this, directly to, 20, 25, 18-year-olds, all just kind of dumbfounded, and the class erupted in laughter for about, 10 seconds, and then somebody raised their hand and took a chance. And who knows what that person said. We don't remember what she said in response. But what we remember is the opportunity, the encouragement, the spirit, the motivation to learn, the connection, the willingness. We remember how she made us feel. But the number one thing that I would recommend to any teacher beginning a lesson, beginning a year, would be to engage, to connect, to spend time with them. When I was working at summer camp and I was working on what we call the challenge course or the ropes course, it's a space of informal learning. We talk about communication, we talk about leadership, we talk about group dynamics, we talk about our emotions and their regulation, and we do all of it in the space that we create. How do we create that social space? We go through a very clear what we call sequence or progression of different sorts of activities. We don't start by sending people to climb a 50-foot tower while everybody else stands on the ground and watches them. That's a dangerous situation. Before we get to that, we play get-to-know-you games, what we call icebreakers or mixers, where it's light, it's fun, it's silly. We then go on to initiatives, where there's a bit of a challenge element, but everybody's on the ground and we're like throwing koosh balls or jumping through hula hoops. Everything is very safe physically, so that we can kind of explore emotionally, socially. We then move from initiatives to low elements, where our feet are only 3 or 4 feet off the ground. And then we go from low elements to high elements. There's a progression that is socially and emotionally based as much as it is physically. What's education missing today? We don't scale the social and emotional with the mental or the intellectual. We go straight to the top of the intellectual. You're learning geometry this year, so you better have learned all of the algebra last year because we're starting at geometry. And if you don't get it, you don't get it. And that's our only focus. We don't think to ourselves in the world of education, these kids are in a new class with a new group of students that they could be threatened by. And we need to address that possibility because that's the possibility they care about before we address any possibility about geometry. How do we connect with our students? How do our students connect with each other? And how are they able or given the opportunity to do it in appreciation, in respect for the novelty of that social and emotional situation just as much as the novelty of that mental or intellectual situation? That's
yeah. Because I think, we're in a position now where we're a lot of, like, in the role of the teacher, historically, one big role of the teacher has been instruction, like theorems, explaining material and sort of like the semantic information that's being conveyed. And importantly, I think that's being outsourced more and more in a variety of ways. So Khan Academy, online learning more generally, AI basically now increasingly in the near future. And I definitely think there's like a place for those things, but also the question of what teachers, like what the role of teachers is, changes a whole lot in that environment. And I think one thing that's kind of interesting, I think that just intersects really well with the kind of thing that you're talking about, that the role then of teachers is to, it is to convey a certain kind of interest, a certain kind of impression, a certain kind of, it's to be motivating and to connect with a person to get them to, I don't know, like figure out who they are, the kind of thing that they want to do with the ample opportunities now that are kind of available to them. So yeah, do you have thoughts on sort of how the educational, I guess really last question here, do you have thoughts on how the role of the teacher changes as a consequence of the development of sort of modern technology, especially related to AI?
The role of the teacher has never and will never change. The role of the teacher is to engage the student culturally on all fronts. And by engage, we mean inspire, give breath to, and to lead to their own breath giving for the topic that teacher is teaching. Whether it's how to use a stone tool, how to make a cave the right way, how to farm on the field, how to do maths on a slate board, how to engage with computers, how to use computers to think for us or do some of our thinking for all of that is simply the what. It's not the how. The people that might be good as what you described as sort of like delivering the theorem teachers, that sort of teacher is going to change because some teachers were really comfortable and loved teaching geometry, and other teachers are really comfortable and are going to love teaching how to prompt a generative AI. Like those keys that they like to play in, that will likely not change, and so who will become a teacher for that reason likely will. But that doesn't change the core role and skill and key of teaching itself. That key is the ability to connect and engage and bring into a culture of another person. And that is a question of connection. That's a question of empathizing, and it's a question of inspiring, of having energy for that inspiration. Some engage with that skill and are better at developing that skill than others. And that kind of teacher, I don't think, is ever going to change. In my mind, the Paula Jays of the world will always have a job, right?
Amazing. Josh, thank you so much for coming and talking to me today. I super appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It was a joy.